2002. But we would not have experienced the catastrophe of 2008. It would have been much better to swallow the bitter tasting medicine back then, because swallowing it in 2008, it was going to taste that much worse. But of course, we passed on that opportunity, and we repeated those mistakes. And so the reckless monetary policies under Greenspan, those that are under Bernanke, are much more reckless. Instead of having interest rates at 1%, now they're 0. And of course, when the dot-coms collapsed, the Federal Reserve didn't start buying up internet companies, but they bought up mortgages, they bought up government bonds, they bought up credit card debt, they bought up student loans and auto loans. The Fed's balance sheet has exploded out of control because of all the paper that they've bought. And the deficits that Obama is running are 3 times the size of the deficits that we had towards the end of the Bush administration. So the Keynesian pump priming is much bigger. So if you can think about how bad the crisis was in 2008, and it was a consequence of the bad monetary and fiscal policy that preceded it, imagine what is in store for us now, considering that the monetary and fiscal policy is maybe 10 times as bad as it was back then. And so what is the position that we're in right now? Interest rates are at 0. They shouldn't be at 0. Interest rates have to be a lot higher. Part of the resolution of our problems is higher interest rates, because we need more savings. Well, nobody's going to save money if interest rates are 0, especially when inflation is where it is. Who's going to save money? Nobody. So interest rates have to go up. But Ben Bernanke, he can't raise rates. Not without bringing back the recession, which is what the government doesn't want. Because if they raise rates, what happens? What happens to housing when rates go up? What happens to the budget deficit when rates go up? They skyrocket because the government is borrowing all this money. The budget deficit for 2011 is 1.6 trillion. The national debt is 14 trillion. All of it is financed, or the majority of it, with short-term treasuries. What happens if rates rise? And when those short-term bonds mature, and now the government has to try to roll them over with much higher interest rates, all of a sudden interest payments on the national debt skyrocket. And that's assuming that we don't have to pay off any of the principal, just rolling over the interest. So Greenspan, Ben Bernanke, doesn't want to raise rates, so we can't solve the problem. But what is he creating by keeping rates down? And one of the reasons they're keeping rates down is they're trying to keep real estate prices high. Real estate prices have to fall. They're too high. But if we let real estate prices fall, a lot of the banks that hold real estate paper will be insolvent again. So we have to try to artificially keep real estate prices high. But there is a consequence to that. They have to keep interest rates really low, and they have to keep printing money. Now, they're calling it quantitative easing. But what quantitative easing is printing money. It's monetizing debt. It's the Federal Reserve printing money and buying bonds. And, you know, the Federal Reserve inflated a stock market bubble in the 1990s. That's where all the cheap money went into, that the Fed was supplying. It went into the stock market. And when that bubble burst, the cheap money went into the real estate market. And when that bubble burst, the cheap money is now going into the government. So we are inflating a government bubble. The government is growing at a pace that is unprecedented in our history. Look at the size of the government. Now, the federal government is now spending $3.7 trillion. It's almost $4 trillion. And as I said, the deficit this year is $1.6 trillion. That was the entire budget at one point during the Clinton administration, and now that's just the deficit. We've added, in the first 2 years of the Obama administration, the national debt increased by $3.5 trillion. And that doesn't count any of the contingency liabilities or things like debt of Fannie and Freddie. $3.5 trillion. That's $1.75 trillion a year of additional debt in a 2-year period of time. I mean, $3.5 trillion. We didn't have a $3.5 trillion national debt until, I think, near the end of Reagan's first term. Yet, Obama accumulated that in 2 years. So, I lost my train of thought. What was I talking about? Yeah, the government bubble, that's right. So now we're inflating the government bubble. But the big difference is, and of course, the government bubble is more damaging because at least during the dot-com bubble, we got a few decent companies out of it. And maybe we overpaid for them, but I mean, there's a few of them that are around. during the housing bubble, at least we got houses. Maybe we have too many houses, we overpaid for them, but they're there, people can live in them. You know, the government bubble is fundamentally far more damaging because all the resources that are being diverted to government are resources that we desperately need in the private sector. But when the government bubble bursts, there's no bailout. See, the government bailed out a lot of entities, a lot of banks, when the real estate bubble bursts. But when the government bubble bursts, there is no bailout because it's the government that's insolvent. And that's what's coming. Right? We're going to have a credit crisis, a sovereign debt crisis, a currency crisis. Because the consequences of this stimulus are apparent now. Look at prices. Look at the prices of commodities that are hitting all-time record highs. Look at corn. Look at sugar. Look at coffee. Look at cotton. You know, cotton prices are over $2 a pound. They were 80 cents a pound a year and a half ago. Prices are going through the roof. Oil is now $100 a barrel and rising. And it's going a lot higher. And it's not a coincidence that prices are going through the roof following the printing of all this money. Because that's what happens. When you print money, money loses value. When money loses value, prices rise. And that's what's happening. And the problem is, it's not just prices here. Prices are rising all around the world. And in fact, many other countries are being more adversely affected by the inflation than we are. Because we're exporting our inflation all around the world. We have the reserve currency. And so when we keep interest rates at zero, a lot of other countries are keeping their rates too low because they don't want their currency to rise too much against the dollar. And as we spend all this newly printed money on imported products, foreign central banks are buying up those dollars to keep their own currencies from rising. But in order to do that, they have to print their own currency. So you have global money supply growth growing at a rapid pace. The consequence is that prices are rising. And this is destabilizing many countries around the world and is becoming very problematic for our trading partners. And I think that this is going to cause them to finally pull the plug on the dollar standard and stop buying our bonds and stop buying our currency. And Ben Bernanke has basically told the world that that's what they should do. He is absolving himself of any responsibility for rising prices. He says that prices are not rising because of quantitative easing, although he says stock prices are rising because of quantitative easing, but for some reason he doesn't think that commodity prices have anything to do with the money that he's printing. But he basically told the world that, hey, if the world doesn't want inflation, they have tools on their own to fight it, and they do. But that means dumping the dollar. That means letting their own currencies appreciate and not buying our bonds. About 2 weeks ago, they had a 10-year Treasury bond auction. I think it was 2 weeks, maybe it was 1 week. But 71%, a record 71% of those bonds were bought by foreign central banks. Now, they didn't want to buy those bonds. I think they felt they had to stop the dollar from collapsing. But pretty soon they're going to realize that letting the dollar collapse is their best alternative. Because it's going to cost them a fortune. Because we're going to keep printing money. We're going to keep borrowing money. As long as the world buys our debt, we're going to keep issuing it. Because that's all the politicians want to do. They don't want to tell the truth. They don't want to tell the American people how bad the situation is. So they want to keep on spending money and printing money. And Ben Bernanke is going to keep on lying that there's no inflation. Because he can't tell the truth. If he tells the truth, if he admits that there's inflation, then he's got to raise rates. And if he raises rates, we're right back in recession. A worse one than we had in 2008, because now we're more in debt than we were in 2008. So he can't raise rates. So he keeps rates down at zero while inflation is running out of control, and he pretends it doesn't exist because he's looking at the core CPI and he's saying it doesn't matter what happens to food prices, it doesn't matter what happens to energy prices because they're not in the core. And what is in the core anyway? You know, and a lot of that stuff is so manipulated with hedonics and substitution and weighting that it's irrelevant. I mean, pretty soon, the only thing we're going to be buying is food and energy. That's going to be it. Because we're not going to have any money left over for anything else. So the core is not going to have any relevance when all you're doing is buying food and energy. But the rest of the world right now is already suffering because people in other countries where they make less money than we do, food and energy is a higher percentage of their expenditures. And so they feel it more acutely when those prices are rising. And what we're doing now is we're asking the world to subsidize us to an even greater